On Monday, June 3rd, the Karen Reed trial continued with day 19 of testimony. The jury has now heard from 53 witnesses, and we're still in the prosecution's case in chief.
It's been 84 years.
Anyway, today the jury heard from 3 of those witnesses. The first was Massachusetts State Police Trooper Kevin O'Hara, and the other 2 were forensic scientists from the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, Maureen Hartnett and Ashley Vaillier. Today we finally got to see some evidence of Karen Reed's bumper and hear what the forensics said about possible DNA on and around the SUV. And we finally got to see what John O'Keefe's clothes looked like on the morning of January 29th, 2022. Is this evidence going to finally start moving this case in the prosecution's direction? Watch until the end and tell me what you think. Let's get into it. Okay, so jumping right in, we got to see finally some testimony from someone who investigated the case from the Massachusetts State Police. No, it was not Trooper Michael Proctor, the lead investigator of this case. That would have been helpful in order to be able to sort of connect the dots of all of these various pieces of evidence, but so be it. We still don't know if the state is going to be calling him as a witness at all, and if that's the case, the defense would probably be the ones to call him in their case in chief. Anyway, the witness here was Trooper Kevin O'Hara. He apparently is the team commander for the Special Response Team. He testified that they do search and rescue and typically come in after a search has already happened once on the scene. He also testified that he led a team that searched the scene at 34 Fairview Road later in the day on January 29th, 2022. Although John O'Keefe was first found around 6 a.m. on January 29th, Massachusetts State Police were notified by an alert about the case more or less just before 4 p.m. Around 5 p.m., Trooper O'Hara got on scene. Basically, the purpose of the testimony was to provide some evidence about finding the first pieces of taillight at the scene. Now, if you remember, Canton PD also did their search of the crime scene between like 6:30 a.m. and 8 a.m. of that same day. This was, of course, where they used a leaf blower to remove snow and unsterilized red Solo cups to gather the blood evidence.
Red Solo cup, I fill you up.
And all investigating witnesses so far have basically verified that the crime scene was not secured between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. on January 29th, 2022. Nevertheless, apparently the Massachusetts State Troopers started digging through the snow for evidence after 5 p.m. And Trooper O'Hara testified as to how they searched the scene. He said they went shoulder to shoulder, they were using some shovels and other tools, and they went in a methodical kind of way. And this is, of course, to ensure that they got everything at the scene. And what they ultimately found at the end of this search was about 5 or 6 pieces of clear and red taillight pieces, as well as John O'Keefe's other shoe. Now, this is going to be interesting to review when we get to testimony about another 40 taillight pieces being found on scene days later, but we'll get there when we get there. Anyway, Trooper O'Hara testified also that he had been initially contacted by Lieutenant Tully from Canton PD to search the scene, and that Lieutenant Tully specifically asked Trooper O'Hara to find taillight pieces and a shoe. Now, this can be interpreted in multiple ways. Either that's just sharing investigative information, like we know that there's this shoe that's missing because we only have one, and we should find it, and we should see about this cracked taillight, so there probably are some taillight pieces around here. Or it could be because there is someone who specifically wants to find these certain things, and maybe they were placed there in between these investigative searches. To some, this sounds particularly shady, especially because of the fact that the crime scene was not actually secured for a good 8-hour stretch during that day. And of course, there also is the bit where the troopers were apparently held back, at least by bureaucracy, if by nothing else, even from when they had initially received information about this search and that they would be eventually going to search the scene themselves, etc. Now, which side you land on that particular issue could depend on what you have in terms of your perspective on the case so far. Now, one thing that did come up on cross-examination was that it was Lieutenant Tully who basically directed the state troopers on where to search for these things. And as we heard much earlier in this trial, Lieutenant Tully was not someone who actually saw John O'Keefe on the ground on scene himself. Instead, he was apparently approximately told where John had been found and went from there. Now, this is another thing that could be an issue for the jury. Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, then at the end of cross-examination, David Yannetti listed out a bunch of dates in February, 6 of them to be exact. This was February 3rd, 4th, 8th, 10th, 11th, and 18th. And he asked Trooper O'Hara if Michael Proctor ever called Trooper O'Hara back to come to 34 Fairview Road to search the scene again. And Trooper O'Hara said on those dates, no. And this does seem to be hinting at something significant to the defense, but it's not clear exactly what that is just yet. So we'll just have to wait and see if the defense introduces some kind of evidence at some point that clarifies this. But at the very least, we do have some evidence now of when, where, and how these taillight pieces and the shoe were discovered, the first 5 or 6 taillight pieces at the very least. So the question for you is, does this move the ball forward for the prosecution's case in chief? Or do you think there are still too many questions about things like the security of the crime scene that mean that you won't be able to trust what the investigators were eventually able to find? Let us know in the comments down below. Okay, so the next witness was Maureen Hartnett. She is a forensic scientist with the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, and her testimony was all about Karen's SUV. Specifically, she started out by testifying about a dent in the rear door of Karen's SUV, as well as a scratch on the back of it. She also, of course, noted the broken taillight and also testified about finding pieces of apparent glass sitting on the bumper, as well as an apparent hair that was about 7/8 of an inch long. As for the glass, this was interesting because on cross-examination, Alan Jackson pointed out that the glass wasn't in any way embedded in the body of the SUV. Instead, it was sitting on top of the bumper. And I will note that this isn't exactly a smooth bumper. It has these sort of deep grooves to it. But Jackson also pointed out that when it was brought in to be examined for evidence, it had to be towed all the way from Dighton, Massachusetts to Canton. And this itself is approximately a 30-minute drive, apparently. Which means, all told, after driving around Canton on the morning of January 29th to find John O'Keefe, this SUV drove out to Dighton. And then it was towed back from Dighton. That is quite a way, and it would seem to have given some kind of an opportunity for this glass to fall off the bumper along that entire route. So whether or not the jury goes for the defense's arguments about that is another question, but the point was definitely made on this cross-examination. Now, as for the apparent hair that was found on the bumper, this was also interesting. The witness testified that this was sent to an in-house lab for further DNA testing, and so I imagine we're going to hear that this was probably a match for John's hair. On cross-examination, however, Ms. Hartnett testified that this hair wasn't embedded in any way, nor was it somehow secured or glued onto the bumper by any other substance, for example, blood. It was apparently just kind of sitting on the bumper, and when she removed it with tweezers, it didn't have any kind of resistance to it. And what's more, Jackson noted that depending on which photo of the hair that you look at, which gives a different kind of an angle, it looks like it curves one way or the other.
So that hair looks, as we're looking at it, you will agree that hair looks like almost like a backward C, correct? In other words, it looks like it's more vertical than flat in that photograph, correct?
I would agree it looks like a C on the side of the car.
If we could go to Exhibit 173. And this is the same hair photographed a second time, correct?
If we could, again, just zoom in on that sticker. Yes, that's correct.
Ms. Hartnett, does it look to you like between the first and the second photographs, that hair has moved? It's no longer an inverted C, but a C.
I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. I see the two ends, which may still be making contact with the vehicle. I can't make that determination based on this photo.
Fair enough. So that was sort of my next question. I'll just dovetail it this way. Did it appear to you that the hair, which is curled, was making contact with the vehicle on the top point and the bottom point?
I would say from this photo, I honestly can't tell if those two ends are coming off the vehicle or touching the vehicle. I just can't make that determination.
But you would agree that that hair was somewhat precariously perched on that vertical quarter panel, correct?
Objection.
I want to sustain the objection, ask it differently.
We can, Mr. Bates, we're finished with that. With the court's permission, we can take that down. If you take a look at the zoomed photos that have just been marked as 259 and 260 respectively, can you take a look at those side by side, and when you're finished, I'd like to ask you a question or two about those.
Okay.
Does it look from your perspective, seeing those photos side by side, that the hair appears to have gently moved just a little bit between the two photos?
I just don't think I can make that determination. They're taken from different angles. I just don't know. I can see that they have a curl in both, but I don't know which ends are making contact or if the ends are coming off the vehicle.
Okay. May I approach you on it?
Yeah.
Now, this is interesting because it introduces all the same questions that I went over with the glass pieces, except that for the glass, you can look at that and say, well, okay, maybe it was just nestled enough into the bumper grooves to not have moved during that entire route. Here, however, it doesn't seem that there is any sort of way for that hair to nestle in. And so it does seem to be somewhat unlikely to be there after so much driving, so much wind, so much snow that fell onto and then eventually melted off of Karen's car. So to me, it does actually seem somewhat strange and unlikely for it to be there. But that's my opinion. What do you think? Let me know in the comments down below. Now, another thing that this witness testified to about biological evidence on the SUV was DNA on the undercarriage of the SUV. She said that she tested several parts under the SUV, including the tailpipe and under the bumper. And interestingly, she said that there was no DNA evidence found from any kind of a human. Anyway, then we got to finally see John O'Keefe's shirt, sweatshirt, and jeans with bloodstains and holes in them. One interesting point was that I thought that the belt was supposed to be missing, but according to what was introduced, it looks like the belt was even still semi-attached to the jeans through the belt loops. Now, one thing to remember about the clothes is that they were cut off of John's body. So one of the first things to notice about these clothes is, of course, these long cut marks. If you remember, that's from the paramedics and not something that either side is really going to be caring much about. But aside from that, the witness noted a number of red-brown marks that appear to be blood. And based on what we know about John O'Keefe's injury so far, it looks like this isn't blood that's sort of seeped through his clothes from the inside. In other words, I don't know of any scratches or gashes that he had on his chest or abdominal area. So this would tell us that the blood would have dropped from his face or maybe his right arm somehow. To me, what seems most likely, just because of the testimony about the amount of blood that was found on his parts of his body, it seems like that blood would most likely have come from his face. Regardless, it didn't seem that there was anyone on either side that was working to sort of connect those dots on that particular issue. So maybe it's not that big of a deal. But it did seem to me that it could make a difference if, say, the prosecution's theory is that John O'Keefe was hit by that car, knocked onto his back immediately, and then just went lights out right away. The blood drips are going to follow the laws of physics and therefore gravity, so it would seem that there would need to be an explanation that involves him being upright even just for a moment. But maybe this is a detail that just gets a little bit too in the weeds for both sides. But maybe not. We'll see about it as trial continues. Anyway, the other part about Ms. Hartnett's testimony about the sweatshirt in particular is the part about the holes in the right sleeve.
What do you recognize that to be?
That is the exterior front of item 7-18, and it also contains markers that I placed on the item to note areas of damage.
And the next photograph would be Ms. Gilman 9796. If you could zoom in on that one. Now, Ms. Hartnett, what we're looking at here, that's the right sleeve of the gray sweatshirt of item 7-18, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so, starting with some of the 13 different areas that you labeled, this starts with 1, 2, 3, 4, and goes up through 9, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you, ma'am.
This is important to both sides of this case because the explanation as to how he got the arm gashes varies very widely between the two. Of course, as I'm sure you know by now, if you have been following this case so far, the defense says that it was caused by Chloe the German Shepherd. The prosecution, however, claims that it's road rash. So a big question that I personally have had throughout this trial is, what does that sweatshirt look like? If the sweatshirt had no damage at all, then the road rash theory is basically completely out. That's because if your skin is going to get caught on the ground as you're sliding on the pavement, it has to go through your clothes first. But if he went into 34 Fairview Road that night, there's a chance that his sweatshirt could have come off while he was inside. Anyway, regardless, the sweatshirt was in fact revealed to have some holes in the right sleeve. And people watching definitely had some different reactions to these holes in the sleeve. Some said, sure, that's probably road rash. Others, however, said that road rash would appear different and that these holes look more like puncture wounds, for example, from a large dog's jaw. For those who say that road rash looks very different, they talked about how there would be much more drag on the sweatshirt to the extent that the holes wouldn't just be small holes, they would end up with outright tears down the sleeve. And this is especially considering the soft material in the sweatshirt. Personally, I don't have any experience with road rash either in my own experiences or in litigating cases. So I don't necessarily have any extra insight to add to this particular point. So I do hope that at least one of the sides is going to have some kind of an expert, maybe one of the accident reconstructionists that is going to be able to testify about this. Now, one final thing about the sweatshirt before we move on to the next witness. Ms. Hartnett also testified to being the one to swab the sweatshirt for a sample to be sent to the veterinary lab at UC Davis. Now, we already know about the results from this DNA testing from Terry Kuhn, who testified 75 years ago in this trial. And so we know that it was negative for dog DNA, but positive for pig DNA. We also know that there could be some issues from the fact that it was taken from a cloth material that had dyes in it. But from Terry Kuhn's testimony, we didn't know how it was swabbed or what the chain of custody was for it. So now we know from this particular witness how that sweatshirt was in fact swabbed for the purposes of this DNA testing.
Indicated that you took 2 swabs from the quote, area around damage, numbers 1 through 9 of the gray sweatshirt, end quote, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, can you describe for the jurors how you took those swabs, and were they of all 9 or a select number of the 9? How did you do that?
I moistened 2 cotton swabs with sterile water, and then I took those 2 swabs. May I use the pointer to just show?
Of course.
And I vigorously swabbed around. I don't know if it's working. Here we go. This entire area. So every area of damage, I swabbed around all of it using the same 2 swabs. So it was one collection from all those areas.
One collection on swab 1 and one collection on swab 2. You just repeated the process.
No, I took them exactly at the same time. So I held the 2 swabs together.
Oh.
And as I'm swabbing, I'm rotating the swabs to make sure that all the exterior of the swab is coming into contact with that material in order to collect equal samples, or at least attempt to collect equal samples on each swab.
Okay, we can take that. Thank you. And you indicated that this was the first time that you had done swabbing specifically for the purpose of trying to find either canine DNA or animal DNA.
That's correct.
Had you been trained at the time that you took the swabs, had you been trained or received any training or any teaching about the relationship between keratinized tissue and DNA?
No.
Do you know what keratinized tissue is?
No.
Did you photograph exactly where any of those swabs were taken, or just notate it in your notes?
I notated in my notes. That overall photo is the photo that I used to describe the sample that I collected.
And I think it probably goes without saying, you didn't videotape your swabbing technique on that shirt either, correct?
That's correct.
Now, there still is a question as to whether that would have been the best item to swab for the DNA, but I don't know. This might actually be enough for the jury to conclude that there really was no dog DNA on the sleeve. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. Anyway, the final witness of the day was Ashley Vaillier. Ms. Vaillier is also a forensic scientist with the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab. And so this testimony was all about the taillight pieces and other small fragments that were found at the scene. Now, we only saw direct examination for this witness, and Adam Lally did not finish today, so this will be continuing on Wednesday. However, what we saw so far was basically that Ms. Vaillier testified about the 45 pieces of taillight from Karen Reed's SUV, as well as the glass pieces and a black plastic straw that was apparently found at the scene. And specifically, we heard a little bit about how these taillight pieces fit together like a big jigsaw puzzle. Now, I will say this was a lot of testimony where photos of pieces of plastic and glass were being shown to the jury. And it wasn't exactly clear from Lally's questioning how all these dots specifically connected. There was some testimony about how some of these were supposedly debris found in some of the clothing, but it got very confusing pretty quickly because of the descriptors Lally was using and just because of how repetitive and drawn out the entire process was. And as always, if the jury is being put to sleep with the testimony, it is far less likely that they are going to understand the narrative and the argument that you are making through this particular witness. So we'll see if he will be able to ask questions that will somehow connect these dots on Wednesday. Because currently, if I'm personally on the jury, I just see that there was a lot of plastic and some glass that this witness examined. And other than that, it's supposed to have come from 34 Fairview Road. I've got to say, this isn't the best work that a prosecutor can do for a case like this. I know we've been talking a lot about Lally and a lot of criticisms about his work as a prosecutor, but this is something that really could be a problem for his case in chief. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you think that the prosecution has in fact moved the ball forward with this testimony? Or do you think that there are some holes from this testimony today? Let us know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you could hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're new here and you want to see more daily coverage of the Karen Read murder trial, both in daily recaps and in gavel to gavel live stream coverage, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next one is out there. See you for day 20.